My name is Walter Briggs. I worked 30 years in maintenance, never asked for much. But when my mother died waiting for a routine surgery, because one man didn't sign her file, I didn't grieve. I made sure he'd never work in silence again.
She raised me alone after my dad disappeared into a bottle and didn't come back out. We live in a single-story house in Camden, New Jersey. Nothing fancy. Small patch of lawn, tools in the garage, the smell of WD-40 in the air. My life was routine. Predictable. Maybe even dull. But it was steady. And I was okay with that. The day things broke, it was a Monday. I came home from the shop around 6, covered in metal shavings, same as usual. My mother was sitting in the recliner, her face pale, breathing shallow. She didn't say anything. Just looked at me like something inside her had finally slipped. I called 911. By the time we got to Cooper Medical, she could barely talk. They ran a scan. Her heart was failing, degenerative, they said. She'd need surgery. A valve replacement, maybe a pacemaker. They called it urgent but manageable. Manageable. That word stuck with me. Her Medicare covered some things. Not all. The cardiologist pulled me aside, said there were programs. We'd need to apply for a surgical subsidy, submit documentation, get approval from the New Jersey Department of Health, and then wait. How long is the wait? I asked. He hesitated. Depends on the case. So I did what they told me. I filed forms. Submitted pay stubs. Printed out letters. I took days off work to visit government buildings where the walls were yellow from old lights and no one met your eye. I waited in lines behind mothers with strollers and men coughing blood into napkins. Each office sent me to another, until I found myself in front of a nameplate that read, Gerald H. Gorman, Regional Eligibility Director. He didn't shake my hand. Didn't look up until I said her name. Evelyn Briggs. Born 1946. Heart valve failure. We submitted the paperwork. He flipped through a folder. Ah, yes. I see here. Then he said it 5 words that would burn into my skull for the rest of my life. We're focusing on younger cases. I stared at him. What the hell does that mean? He looked like a man who'd explained this many times before. Cold eyes. Neat hands. The kind that have never turned a wrench. It means we have limited resources and we need to allocate them toward patients with longer expected recovery yields. I said, she worked 40 years in this country. He said, I understand. Truly. But the data prioritizes based on post-surgical productivity. Post-surgical productivity. That's what my mother was now. A chart point. A percentage. I walked out of there sick. I still hoped. Called hospitals. Asked about charity programs. Looked into loans. But by the time I found an out-of-state clinic that would take her for a reduced cost, it was too late. She passed 3 weeks later. In her sleep. No surgery. No chance. And no one called to say sorry. The last time I saw her, she squeezed my hand. Could barely speak. But her eyes, they still had something in them. Like she was waiting for me to fix it. But I couldn't. And that's the thing. I fix things for a living. I make broken machines run again. I know the sound of something dying. I know when it's too late. That night, after the funeral, I opened her mail. There it was. A thin letter from the state. We regret to inform you that the application for surgical subsidy has been denied. I stared at it until my eyes dried up. Then I folded it, put it in my back pocket. And I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just sat there in the kitchen we'd shared for 30 years and I made a decision. Not a violent one. Not reckless. But final. I was going to bury Gerald Gorman. Not with fists. Not with bullets. With paperwork. With silence. With ruin. Because I know systems. I know weight loads and slow failures and how metal warps under pressure. And men like Gerald? They don't break loud. They break quietly. When no one's looking. The week after the funeral, I went back to work. Didn't say much. Just clocked in, tightened bolts, checked coolant flow in hydraulic lines. The shop smelled the same, burnt grease, warm iron, but the world didn't. I was seeing it different now. I stopped eating lunch with the guys. Stopped taking the shortcut home. I didn't even listen to the radio anymore. Everything that didn't move me forward felt like a distraction. I wasn't grieving. I was recording. I started with Gerald Gorman. I looked him up the old way through paper records and county filings. Found his house in Cherry Hill. Nice place. Corner property. Big bay window in front and a brand new Subaru in the driveway. He lived alone. Divorced. No kids. Public record. He worked out of the regional office in Trenton 4 days a week and did remote consultations from home on Fridays. His LinkedIn profile said he specialized in equitable care distribution. Big words for someone who played God with a rubber stamp. I wasn't interested in hurting him. I wanted to study him. So I watched. Drove by slow a few times a week at different hours. Made mental notes of what days his trash bins were full. What time the porch light came on. The name of the woman who cleaned his gutters on Saturdays. One morning I followed him to his office. Parked across the street in a lot near a diner. I watched him get out of his car in a crisp blazer, coffee in one hand, leather satchel in the other. He didn't look evil. He looked comfortable. Like nothing in the world had ever touched him too deeply. I spent the next 2 months learning the system that protected him. Not just the rules. The culture. I started talking to people in line at clinics. At the DMV. At the county benefits office. I didn't tell them what I was doing. Just listened. Took notes. Every story sounded the same. Long waits. Denials. Cold offices. No one to call. No appeal. No face to blame. And Gerald? He was just the tip of a system that counted on exhaustion to silence people. It was never about no, it was about eventually. Most folks give up before they even get to the rejection letter. But I didn't. I made a list. A quiet, private list of everyone who'd touched my mother's file. From the intake nurse who filed the form late, to the woman at the records office who sent it to the wrong department, to the clerk who put the final stamp on the envelope that said, denied. I didn't want revenge on all of them. Just removal. See, people like that think the worst thing that can happen is a confrontation. They're wrong. The worst thing is becoming accountable. So I started writing letters. Anonymous. Professional. With just enough detail to sound internal. One to the ethics committee of the hospital mentioning discrepancies in how subsidy cases were prioritized by age. One to the local paper's health desk citing whistleblower concerns and giving them 3 names to start with. One to Gerald's supervisor in Trenton, typed, mailed, untraceable, raising concerns about possible data irregularities in the New Jersey health subsidy pipeline. I sent them from 4 towns over with different return addresses. Then I waited. Not for results. For pressure. Because pressure always shows you where the cracks are. And I knew Gerald had plenty. He started showing up later to the office. One morning I saw him come in without his blazer. His face looked tight. I saw him arguing on the phone in the parking lot, slamming the car door hard enough to rattle the frame. A month after the last letter, I drove past his house on a Saturday. The gutter woman was gone. So was the Subaru. Just him. Alone on the porch. Staring out into nothing. The papers had started asking questions. And the audit? It was coming. The first time I knew it was working, I didn't see it. I heard it. I was at a diner in Trenton, same one across the street from the regional office, same booth I'd sat in 3 or 4 times before. The waitress knew me as the guy who always ordered black coffee and tipped in exact change. At the booth behind me, 2 men in shirt sleeves were talking. Quiet but urgent. One of them said, "Did you hear? Audit's expanding. Gorman's under review." Somebody flagged his caseload irregularities going back years. I didn't turn around. Just stirred my coffee and smiled into the steam. A week later, the office directory changed online. Gerald's name was still there, but the title had dropped from director to just administrator. No announcement. No email blast. Just a silent emotion buried in the fine print. He'd been clipped. That's how bureaucracies punish their own. Not with blood, with absence. But that wasn't enough. Not for me. Not after what he'd done. What he hadn't done. You have to understand, this wasn't about justice. Not in the big, noble way people like to talk about. This wasn't courtroom drama. No gavel. No jury. This was about taking something back. About making him look in the mirror and see the face of a man who let someone die because it was easier than pushing a file forward. So I kept going. The news picked up the thread. Small at first. An investigative piece on healthcare bottlenecks. Buried on page 4. But it quoted an anonymous source from inside the department. That source was me. I'd been slipping typed pages under the door of a reporter named Arlene Cho. She worked the city desk. Never smiled on TV. She didn't need to. She printed what I gave her. 1 article turned into 3. Then a segment on local cable. Then a petition with over 5,000 signatures calling for a formal inquiry into regional care denial rates and a name at the top of the public pressure list, Gerald H. Gorman. I watched it all unfold the same way I watch machines fail. First, the tiny tremors. Then the rattling. Then the pop. And then everything comes down at once. The best part? I never touched him. I never said a word in person. But every morning he had to walk past a building that no longer greeted him.
Sorry to interrupt your viewing experience, but we really need your support, namely a subscription to the channel, which can make it possible to hire a professional voice actor and make the best content for you.
Every day he sat in a cubicle without a door. And every time his phone rang, I like to think he flinched, wondering if it would be the call that ended the game. And still, I wasn't done. I requested my mother's full medical file. Legally, I was entitled. What I got back was 62 pages bound in blue plastic. Most of it expected intake notes, vitals, progress sheets. But on page 47 I found it. A handwritten note, scrawled in pen. Sloppy. Patient eligible under secondary exception code 417. C. Approval pending supervisory review. Dated 4 days before she died. Which meant she was approved. They just never told us. Because Gerald never signed. He let it sit. Maybe it was laziness. Maybe he thought she'll die anyway. Maybe he just forgot. It doesn't matter. He held the paper that could have saved her and he left it on a desk. That night, I drove to his neighborhood. I didn't get out of the truck. Just parked far enough to see the glow of his kitchen light through the blinds. I thought about throwing a rock through it. But that would have been too easy. Instead, I just whispered, I know. Not for him. For me. Because once you know the truth, really know, it burns hotter than rage. And I wasn't angry anymore. I was focused. When they called for a public hearing, I almost didn't go. I wasn't big on cameras or microphones. Never trusted anything that needed batteries to work. But this was different. It wasn't for show. It was for weight. Weight leaves a mark. And I wanted Gerald to feel mine. The county health board held the hearing in a municipal building with cracked tile and too many ceiling fans. 5 committee members sat at a folding table. A handwritten sign taped to the door read, Public comment, State Health Allocations Review. Gerald sat on the far side of the room. I recognized the slope of his shoulders before I saw his face. He looked older. Grayer. The kind of tired that doesn't sleep off. He didn't see me. The hearing was scheduled for 2 hours. It ran nearly 4. People stood up one after another and told their stories. A woman whose husband died waiting for dialysis. A father whose child was denied rehab after a car crash. A grandmother who'd been told she wasn't priority material. I didn't speak right away. I waited until the end. Then I stood. I'm not here to make speeches, I said. My voice didn't shake. I'm here because my mother died waiting for a stamp on a form. One signature. That's all she needed. I held up the printed page. The one from her file. Page 47. She qualified. You had the code. You had the clearance. But the man in charge, I looked straight at Gerald. He let it sit. And she never got her second chance. No one interrupted. I kept going. I'm not a lawyer. I'm not a doctor. I turn bolts for a living. But I know what happens when you don't tighten something down. You get a collapse. And it's never the person at the top who gets crushed first. It's always the ones at the bottom. I didn't yell. I didn't need to. I walked out after that. Didn't wait for applause. Outside it was raining. As I stepped off the curb, a woman caught up to me. She had red hair and an old army jacket. Your mom, she said. She worked at the St. Clair's Bakery, didn't she? I nodded. She used to give me a roll every Friday after school when I was broke. Wouldn't take $1. Just smiled and told me you'll pay it forward one day. I didn't know what to say. So I just said she was good. She nodded. She was better than good. Thank you for coming today. That's when I realized something. This wasn't about Gerald anymore. This was about a whole goddamn pile of Geralds. All those quiet little men behind counters and windows with pens and checklists and no skin in the game. They thought pain was paperwork. But pain has a memory. And memory has a voice. The next week, I read the article in the Camden Ledger. Health Department Administrator resigns amidst care denial probe. No criminal charges. No indictment. Just resignation. But the article named him. Showed his face. It said, sources indicate multiple cases of negligence tied to unprocessed authorizations. I folded the paper. I didn't feel joy. I didn't want it. What I wanted was for him to feel what my mother felt in those last days. Alone. Helpless. Abandoned by people who were supposed to help. That can't be taught. That can't be forced. But sometimes, just sometimes, you can drag a man into that same cold water and make him understand what it means to be left floating. And I wasn't done yet, because Gerald wasn't the only one who signed her away. After Gerald resigned, things got quiet again. That worried me. Quiet means people are waiting to forget. So I didn't let them. I took every paper I had, every page of my mother's file, every copy of those anonymous letters, every article that had run about the department, and I boxed them up. Then I walked into the Camden Public Library and asked to see the community liaison. An older woman in a gray sweater looked me up and down. You have a complaint? No, I said. I have proof. She let me speak. I told her everything, not just about Gerald, but the others. The way applications disappeared. How no one answered phones after 3 p.m. How people died while their papers sat in forgotten trays. She said, "You sound like a man with a cause." I said, "No, ma'am. I'm just a man who's out of patience." That conversation led to a public records petition. Then a panel review. Then a nonprofit started by a former nurse I met outside the hearing who used to process applications before she got fed up and quit. They called it the 417 Project, named after the code on my mother's file. They didn't know I started it. Didn't need to. I wasn't looking for credit. I wanted results. By the end of that year, the New Jersey Health Subsidy Office had been audited again. They cut 3 layers of middle management, rebuilt the approval process, created something called real-time exception tracking, whatever the hell that means. All I cared about was this. They had to pick up the phone now. The system was changing not because I yelled, but because I pressed. Quietly. Constantly. With pressure they couldn't shake off. And yet something was missing. I'd been building a kind of justice from the outside. But the people still inside, the ones who watched my mother's file rot and said nothing, they were still there. Quiet. Protected. So I went back to the hospital. I walked the same hallway I'd walked the day she collapsed. The same nurse was on shift. She didn't recognize me. I asked to speak to the administrator. He was new. I told him I had questions about a file from last year. I gave him the name. He pulled it up. Page 47 still had that scrawl. Approval pending. I asked, "Does that signature look complete to you?" He frowned. "No. There's no supervisory timestamp." So technically, I said, she was approved but never activated? Yes, he admitted. In legal terms, that's a denial by omission. That's what they called it. Denial by omission. She didn't die because someone said no. She died because no one said anything. Before I left, I asked him one more question. How many others are there? He didn't answer. Didn't have to. I knew that look. I'd seen it in the shop when an apprentice stripped a thread and didn't want to admit it. Shame. Quiet. Deep. I walked out of there with something heavier than before. And that night, I did what I'd avoided for months. I opened her closet. Her apron was still hanging on the hook. The one she wore at St. Clair's when she came home smelling like bread and cinnamon and hope. I folded it gently. Put it in a wooden box. That was the only shrine I kept. No medals. No obituaries. Just the thing she wore when she still believed people took care of each other. That's what I was going to fix. But first, the clerk. The one who stamped incomplete on her final submission. I still remembered his name. And I had his shift schedule. His name was Martin Feld. I found it on the intake log from my mother's first hospital visit. He was the last signature before the application was supposed to be flagged for immediate review. The file was marked incomplete even though everything was there: scans, labs, primary care referral, everything. But Martin had marked it differently. One stamp. One wrong checkbox. That was all it took. I didn't want to hurt him. I just wanted to know if it was carelessness or something worse. He still worked in the records department at Camden General. I waited outside the service entrance for 2 mornings, drinking gas station coffee and watching staff come and go. On the 3rd day, I saw him, short sleeves, loose ID lanyard, walking fast with his head down. Like someone used to being invisible. I followed him to the bus stop. Didn't speak. Just sat down 2 benches over and waited. He looked over once, then back at his phone. After 3 stops, I stood and got off. Walked 3 blocks and circled back to my truck. I'd seen his face. He didn't look like a monster. Just another man trying to get through the day. That made it worse. Because it wasn't hate that killed my mother. It was indifference. The kind that comes in beige offices and bad lighting and quiet nods from coworkers who've stopped noticing mistakes. So I did what I came to do. I filed a complaint with the Office of Professional Oversight Anonymous again. Attached a copy of the intake sheet and the final medical denial. Highlighted Martin's name and requested a review of all files he touched that month. Didn't sign it. Didn't wait for a reply. That was all. I didn't want him fired. I didn't want him ruined. I wanted him to be forced finally to look at what he'd done. 2 weeks later, the hospital issued a public statement. They were conducting a comprehensive audit of patient records following allegations of internal mishandling. They didn't say Martin's name. But they didn't have to. His job would never be quiet again. By the time summer rolled in, the reforms were rolling, too. More staff. New oversight layers. Real-time application status reports mailed to families weekly. A hotline. A name to call. A face to speak to. And the 417 project? They were building an online database of denied applications searchable by code, date, and resolution. One line at the top read. Every number is a name. Every name is a story. I visited my mother's grave on her birthday. Laid a cinnamon roll on the headstone. Stood there until the wind chilled through my jacket. I whispered, "It's done, Mom. They know now." But as I turned to leave, I felt something heavy settle in my chest. Not relief. Not peace. Just the weight of having become someone else. I used to believe the world was held together by process, that if you followed the rules, good things came. That if you worked hard, stayed quiet, and respected the system, it would hold you in return. I don't believe that anymore. I believe in people. And people get tired. People cut corners. People let papers rot when no one's watching. So now I watch. I volunteer twice a week at the community health office just to sit in, just to see who's getting help and who's getting ignored. No badge. No job title. Just another old man with a notebook and a memory like a vice. Because justice isn't a courtroom or a verdict. Sometimes justice is just showing up long enough that no one can lie anymore. That's what I learned. That's what I earned. And that's what I'll leave behind.
What do you think of the story? Write in the comments.